Are we ready, Tom?
We're ready.
Excellent. Welcome one and all. It is I, Rick Priestley, yet again, rambling on about the old days in front of Tom, who's pointing a camera at me. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
Right, well, as I say, today we're going to talk about the old days, specifically Warmaster. Now, Warmaster was a game I produced for Games Workshop around about the year 2000, if I remember right. It's different from Warhammer and 40k, the other games I did for Games Workshop, in that it's a small-scale war game. So rather than 28mm, it's nominally 10mm, although the figures themselves are usually about 10 to 12mm, and of course you can use any scale figures you like to play it. So what makes it different? Well, that primarily, but also it's a command-based game. So I had the idea for doing a game that was essentially command and control based rather than combat based. So the combat is relatively predictable, but the movement of the troops and the command and whether you get your charges in and how you maneuver is all done with dice. So it's less predictable. And some people like that and some people don't, but I thought it was an interesting idea. I stole the core mechanic from Jervis Johnson. Cheers, Jerv. It's a sort of a variation on the rollover mechanic in Blood Bowl. So a unit can actually continue to move until it fails an order, which potentially can give it, potentially can give it an infinite set of orders, but in practice it tends to mean you get maybe 1, 2 or potentially 3, each order being successively more difficult. So we produced it, as I say, in 2000. It wasn't originally intended to be a kind of book. It was originally intended to be a boxed game, and we were going to make it in plastic, and the figures were going to be our classic epic scale, which is about 8mm. Now we produced a whole series of test pieces at 8mm size, and some of these are still in my collection, and I've brought them along today, and I'm sure Tom will fit them in. We basically thought, well, if we do a small-scale war game, why not extend it out to include all those classic sieges that we always thought were part of the Warhammer history. So the original box set was going to be plastic armies and also plastic siege pieces, including a castle, for which I designed a little wall section in plastic that could be reproduced, and you would have this whole siege lines with the machines and everything. That was the original intention, and when I started the game development, that was how we worked it. But what happened in the meantime was we produced a game called Titan Legions, which was also epic scale, which didn't do very well. And because those were the days when Games Workshop was expanding rapidly, and we were beholden to Spanish and French and German companies, none of these felt ready to do an epic scale game. In fact, they didn't feel ready to do epic scale of any kind. They just didn't like it. So the demand came through that the games had to be 28mm. And at that point, I thought, well, bugger. Because here I am, and I've got this small-scale war game that I've been working on. That's quite working out rather nicely, and I thought this was going to be quite successful. So I kind of put it on the back burner. But when I got a chance, I relaunched it in the format which maybe people are familiar with, which is a book with a range of metal figures to go with it. Bit disappointing. It could have been a plastic set, and in fact I still have a set of the masters we did for it in plastics, which if Tom will remind me, I'll go and fetch, and you can take photographs later. Sure. But it was not to be. It wasn't marketed terribly enthusiastically by Games Workshop. I think they felt it was, a lot of the sales companies rather felt that it was being foisted upon them by these crazy games designers. Yeah, maybe it was probably a little bit past its sell-by date by the time we launched it. If it had been 4 years, say, previously, or maybe a little bit earlier, I think it would have done very well. As it was, the company wasn't in a position to really support another game of that size. But there you go, that's what happens. Oddly enough, Richard Halliwell, for it was he, did design a previous version of Warhammer Epic, as we called it. And that again was going to be 8mm. And that was probably in the late 1990s. And Hal never finished it. His conception was a little different. He had this idea that the combat would take place with different coloured dice that were variously marked, so kills and saves, which was quite advanced really in its way. That's an interesting idea, because so many games now use that as a core mechanic rather than a numbered based dice system. But when I came to do it, I wanted to do something more traditional in terms of the dice, also cheaper. It's phenomenally expensive to produce dice that have specific markings on them, especially in those days, especially then. So conventional dice were to be used. I developed that game largely with the help of the games designers at Games Workshop. So everyone pitched in. There was a certain enthusiasm for it amongst the game players. And Stefan Hess, who's at the time, he was quite a well-known Warhammer champion in Germany. And I'd met him in America when I was over there for a games day, I think. And we got talking, and he offered to help me out. Now, he used to run a computer design company, I think a games-based design company. And he produced some little, like, I suppose you'd call it an app these days. He produced a little app that I could use to work out calculations and things, which was very clever. But he also helped me out with games testing for Warmaster. And he persuaded me in the end not to use my original concept for the combat. The conceit I had initially was, right, I'm going to design a game that doesn't use any Warhammer mechanics. That was just a challenge I set myself. Well, when it came down to it, the system I had for combat was a factor-based system. So you've got a factor for attack, a factor for defense. You added a random number, and then you cross-referenced on a chart to find out whether you got a kill or not. Which is a little bit like the old WRG system, if anyone knows that. But, by the by. What we did was, I made it work, and it worked, but nobody liked it. I think the problem was all the people I was playing with were Warhammer players. And Stefan said, well, it works, but I don't see why you just don't use Warhammer. And I thought, oh, okay. So I thought, okay, I will. I'll just go, you roll to hit, you roll to save. Damn, it works wonderfully. Everyone liked it. There you go, just shows you game designers don't know best. And a good tip, actually, always listening to what your players are saying, because actually the way the game plays and the way it's enjoyed is more important than any kind of clever little design idea that you've got in your head. Damn it. But never mind, you always learn these things when it's too late. After Warmaster, I thought, this is a cool system. Why don't I do a version of this for Ancients? Because I've always been a big passionate Ancients player. So I got together with, I think it was Rob Broom at the time, who was running the Warhammer Historical, and we arranged to do an Ancients version, Warmaster Ancients, which was, again, relatively popular. I do have copies of it. I'm sure Tom will stick them in here. I can wave one around for you, look. Hey, there you go. That's my markup copy, so it's got a big white sticker on it. But that's the core game, and those are the supplements we did for it. Medieval and Ancient Armies, which just extends the army lists out. And that's the original Warmaster, of course. Yeah, so we were reasonably successful with that, and we enjoyed that. And for a little while, it was quite a popular little game system for Ancients. I think it still has a bit of a following, and I was quite proud of it. I thought this is not a bad game. This works well. And consequently, I ended up playing it quite a bit. In fact, compared to Warhammer and 40k, which had already kind of passed into the hands of other designers, and I'd kind of seen them off in that way that you do. Your children disappear, and you go, good luck, I hope it works out well. Warmaster I kind of kept. Now, you might say it's because no one else wanted it, but actually I was really enthusiastic about it and I wanted to continue with it. So I did play in tournaments and I had a number of armies, including my orcs, Ricklug's orcs, which I'm sure Tom will show you some pictures of. That was my biggest army and it was the one that I used most in tournaments. And I used to organise tournaments and campaigns at Games Workshop in those days. I later thought, well, it's big enough, I can do something else. I ended up with a Chaos Army, which is a little bit more, competitive, let's say. And I actually won some games with that. I don't think I won all that very often with the Orcs. I used to always aim for what I called mid-table respectability, rather than propping up the table. Strongest man award, as we say, which I won more often than not, quite frankly. But I also put a Lizardman army together, which is probably my nicest army, and I enjoyed painting that, and I never actually got to use it. Maybe one or two sort of social games, but I never used it in competition. It was a bit of a shame, really. And then after, as I say, I got into the Ancients version, and I put together some versions of that. Now, Alan and Michael Perry actually made some 10mm strip figures, including some Romans, which I painted up and put together. They didn't enjoy doing them, and they said they were too small, because the Perrys were sculpting 1-to-1, of course. I think it was Mike that did the Romans, and I think Alan actually did a 7 Years' War army, which I've also got. So I do have those, but they are genuine 10mm, so they are quite small. My other army is Huns. The Huns were put together by mixing the Kislev horse archers from Games Workshop with a variety of Germans, mostly from Steve Barber, and bits and pieces. I think I don't even remember who from what manufacturer, but so they're a bit of a mixed army, but they're nice enough, quite big. Painting a Germanic horde in 10mm was quite an effort, and I look at it now and I think, how did I do it? I think my eyesight was better. In fact, I wonder if the reason my eyesight is not so good these days is something to do with all these 10mm figures I've painted. Be a lesson. That'd be a warning to you. I think that's about it for Warmaster. As I say, I did continue playing it for quite a while, and then after I'd launched Warmaster, we thought, well, it'd be great to try to continue to support this in a way, and this gave us the idea of doing the whole Fanatic studio, and we called them secondary games, or it was a very sort of descriptive title, secondary games. People didn't like that, so we thought, well, Fanatic was a great way of explaining what this is, because it's a reference to Goblin Fanatics, and it's a reference to the fact that people are very, very passionate about some of the games we do that we no longer supported in a conventional manner. Mostly because, as I said earlier, or possibly later, we transitioned the company from being English language only to being multiple language, and it expanded, and it had given us all sorts of logistical problems. Made it very difficult to support all the games we did properly. And so that got taken over by Fanatic. I think Jervis might have started it. Steve Hambrook became a big part of it, who's sadly missed, and he was a very enthusiastic Warmaster player, and he actually ran the Warmaster tournaments after a while and produced the magazine for it, Warmag. And Andy Hall took over after that. So it was, I think it was a good experiment, and it was a good way of learning the trade for some of these guys. So the Fanatic little project was a way of extending Warmaster and other games out into the world. And I think it was quite a successful one, really. After I left Games Workshop, I thought I'd use the same system to develop a 28mm game for Warlord. In fact, originally, Black Powder was developed whilst I was still at Games Workshop. Now come to think of it, it was going to be a Warhammer historical game. But when John Stallard left Games Workshop, he asked if he could take that, because he'd been involved in the development of it, he asked if he could take that manuscript for himself and produce it at Warlord, which I was happy for him to do. I think by that time Warhammer Historical was pretty much winding down. The enthusiasm for it amongst the senior management was always, let's say, toleration rather than enthusiasm. And they were it was becoming obvious that we were going to be closing it down at some point. A great shame, in my opinion. But nonetheless, I thought, well, Black Powder is going to get widowed if I'm not careful. So what I did was I helped John. We put together that game, and it was launched through Warlord. It's been very successful and influential, actually. And as I say, it was an adaptation of Warmaster, quite a significant one. You know, the core system is obviously inspired by Warmaster rather than taking the mechanics literally. But it was done as originally as a conversion. In fact, it was Jervis Johnson that started it rather than me. He thought it would be cool to use Warmaster to play big games of Napoleonics. The inspiration for that came from us playing big games of Napoleonics round at the Perry's house, Alan Perry, I think mostly. We were using, I don't know what rules we were using. Let me think. Yeah, it might have been Chaco or something like that. But the games were taking forever. So we were starting 6 o'clock in the evening, you know, after work, and we weren't getting the games finished by midnight. By midnight, we were just about closing because the armies were so big. And it was Jervis that thought, well, we could just use Warmaster for this. So he went and he produced a few sheets of A4 paper, basically converting Warmaster into 28mm, and that's essentially the start of the whole Black Powder project. Then afterwards, I thought, well, people enjoy Black Powder. I certainly enjoyed playing it, and we got games played in a reasonable time. Why not use it for Ancients? So we had a go, and again, Hail Caesar was the result of that. So isn't it odd? You go from a fantasy game to a historical game, to an Ancients game, in fact, then to a Black Powder game, and then to an Ancients game again. And now we've just released a epic version of Hail Caesar, which says it's gone back to a small game again. It's all crazy mad stuff, I'll tell you. So there you are. I think that's probably the whole story of Warmaster. Phew. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. As they say on these videos, keep watching, like and subscribe.